Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be comparing two of the most influential authors in the history of science fiction, Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. There are many authors that deserve to be mentioned in any discussion of classic science fiction, including Robert A. Heinlein, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Philip K. Dick, just to name a few, but the reason why I wanted to focus on Clarke and Asimov is because of the similarity in their writing styles, including a focus on science and ideas-driven storytelling. The question is, who did it best? Today, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to each of the writers' achievements, then I'm going to break down their writing by plot, world building, concepts, characters, and prose, and let you know who I think did which the best. And then finally, I'm going to share my average ratings for each of their books. Both of these writers were rather prolific, so I haven't read their entire bibliographies, but I have read a combined 14 Clarke and Asimov books, and I'm going to share what I think are their relative strengths and weaknesses in order to help us reach a verdict. So as we take a look at some of Asimov's achievements, we can see he was incredibly productive as a writer and has been acknowledged at the highest levels of science fiction. He received too many awards for me to list them all, so I've just included the Hugos and Nebulas. And he probably could have won a lot more Nebulas because that award only started in 1966. Then moving over to Arthur C. Clarke, we can see that he didn't write quite as many stories as Asimov, but was still very accomplished. Asimov won more Hugos, but Clarke won one more Nebula. So now it's time to compare their style and execution when it comes to different elements of their writing, and I'll let you know which of them I prefer. Starting with plot. So something that I like about Clarke's stories is that he often does a great job of building mystery and intrigue. For example, what do these aliens want? Or what is this mysterious object hurtling through space? He often hooks me in with his premises and then manages to build the tension and escalate from there. Sometimes it does slow down a little bit when he gets focused on the science and the ideas, and that's okay, but generally I'm pretty invested in the narrative. When it comes to Asimov, I do think he has some very clever stories. The End of Eternity, in particular, his time travel story, I thought was very clever indeed. But I think Asimov relies a little bit more on exposition. They both do to some extent, but I would say Asimov more so. And sometimes for me, it feels like Asimov's stories kind of progress in the format of this, and then this, and then this, and it doesn't quite ramp up the way I want it to be as narratively satisfying as much as the ideas are. So while I enjoy both their stories, I'm going to have to give the point for this one to Arthur C. Clarke. Next up, we have world building. With Arthur C. Clarke's books, I think he takes us to some interesting and varied settings, and The City and the Stars in particular, I think has some of his best world building. That futuristic city is very well thought out indeed. But I don't know if this is as much of a focus for Clarke as it is for Asimov. Asimov does a great job of taking technologies and ideas and seeing how that would influence a future world and really sort of crafting a society and looking at how that would influence people and relationships. And obviously, this is most well done or most well known in his Foundation series. Foundation is incredibly influential. I think even in modern books being released in 2024, you can see how that has had an impact. People are sort of kind of using that as an influence, a template, the gold standard. Well, Dune is actually probably number one for that, but Foundation definitely up there in the discussion. So for world building, I'm giving the point to Isaac Asimov. Moving on, we have the concepts. So this is definitely a strength for both writers. If I'm going to have to pick a winner here and give one a 10 out of 10, then the other is at least a 9 out of 10 as well. So when it comes to Isaac Asimov and his concepts, he's obviously a brilliant mind. He had some very interesting ideas in terms of futuristic technology, scientific concepts, and as I mentioned, those inform his world building. I find these ideas to be very intellectually stimulating, but here's the thing, I find Arthur C. Clarke's concepts to be intellectually stimulating and emotionally stimulating. He has this incredible knack for taking these grand ideas and making them feel personal. I'm going to try not to use this phrase too many times throughout this video, but I think Clarke is the master of sense of wonder sci-fi. And so for that reason, while I think both of these authors are elite in this category, I'm going to have to give the point to Arthur C. Clarke. Up next, characters. So this is a category that classic sci-fi writers and hard sci-fi writers are not typically known for, so it'll be interesting to see who gets the point here. For me, when it comes to Arthur C. Clarke and his characters, I feel like they rarely get in the way of the story, but they are rarely the highlight of the story either. They're just kind of there, they serve a purpose, they move things along, and It's not really a plus or minus too much either way. Although I will say with his book A Fall of Moondust, we have some characters that are confined to a particular location, and because we have to spend a little bit more time with them, I think in that book he does put a little bit more effort into fleshing out those characters and relationships, so he does display some skill there, but I would definitely say that is not his primary strength as a writer. When it comes to Asimov, I think it's slightly different in that sometimes his characters do annoy me, sometimes the dialogue I do bump up against a little bit, but I think the high points are higher. I think he does have some characters that are more memorable, probably the Mule from the Foundation series being the most memorable to me, so even though I don't think this is a particular strength of either writer, for those higher high points, I'm going to give the point for this one to Isaac Asimov. And finally we have prose. So for me, I think this is the only category that wasn't particularly close. For me, when it comes to Asimov's writing style, I think he is rather short and to the point. Sometimes people can find it a little bit dry, but I think it serves the story. He doesn't necessarily elevate the story with his prose, but I think he gets the job done. When it comes to Clarke, this is something that I actively enjoy about his writing, and I think it's something that is a little bit underrated. I think Clarke deserves a little bit more credit for how good he was as a writer. I think pretty much all of his books will have several quotes that I find to be extremely beautiful or memorable, and it's just a very pleasurable page-by-page reading experience. In preparation for this video, I read a couple of Asimov and Clarke books that I hadn't gotten to yet, and I was enjoying the Asimov books, but whenever I picked up a Clarke book, just page one, I was instantly in just sort of a happy reading place. It was a very fun, easy, enjoyable, rewarding reading experience going through Arthur C. Clarke's prose, and I don't think that gets mentioned enough. So for me, the clear winner in this category, Arthur C. Clarke. So as we reach the end of our writing breakdown, it was neck and neck, but in the end, I gave the victory 3-2 to Arthur C. Clarke. But now it's time to see if that is reflected in my actual reading experiences as I share each of my ratings for all of the Clarke and Asimov books that I have read and see who has the higher average rating. And I'll just preface this by saying these ratings are based on my subjective reading experiences, and on my rating scale, an average book is a 5 out of 10, although my average score that I end up giving is probably closer to a 7, just because I'm mostly reading things that are highly rated, recommended, and things that I think I'll enjoy. So let's get into the ratings, starting with Isaac Asimov and I, Robot. I, Robot was an 8 out of 10 for me. It is a fix-up novel where Asimov took some of his robot stories and combined them together into a novel. I thought that each of these stories had a very clear idea and was interesting to explore, and the first and last stories were my favorite, so that was nice for those to be bookended by my favorites. Then we have Foundation. So I gave Foundation an 8.5 out of 10. This is another example of Asimov taking some of his stories and then putting them into the novel format. This takes his first 4 Foundation stories, as well as an additional introduction that he wrote specifically for the novel. So I love Foundation. I thought the world building was incredible, the ideas were amazing. The characters weren't the focus, but it did even have some memorable characters as well. Really, the only thing that held Foundation back from being one of my all-time favorites is that I didn't find the end overly satisfying, and that's because it isn't a traditional novel with a traditional climax. It is sort of part of the ongoing Foundation stories, but still really enjoyed the book Foundation. Next up, Foundation and Empire. So I think this might be the most controversial score that I give today, but Foundation and Empire for me was a 6.5 out of 10. And I know what you might be thinking, Jonathan, what about the Mule? You even said yourself how much you love the Mule, and I would agree with that, but the thing about Foundation and Empire is it's split into 2 parts. And the first part I found to be a little slow and a little bit anticlimactic, and the Mule isn't present for that story. Then in the second half, yes, I loved every scene, every chapter featuring the Mule, but chapters without the Mule I found to have some of the most annoying characters that Asimov has ever written, and the rest of the story really just didn't click for me. So while I do think this book has some high points and is definitely worth reading, I didn't enjoy it as much as the first Foundation book. And then Second Foundation. Second Foundation for me was a 7 out of 10. I didn't find the ideas quite as intriguing and interesting as I did with the first Foundation book, but I did like the conclusion. I found it to be rather clever and satisfying and a worthy conclusion to the original Foundation trilogy. Moving on, we have The Caves of Steel. The The Cage of Steel is a detective sci-fi novel set in Asimov's robot universe, and I thought as a detective story it was pretty good, and in terms of futuristic world building, it was also pretty good, but neither of them hit the high points that I know Asimov is capable of. So I did enjoy this one. If you like the robot stories, I think this one is worth checking out, especially if you like a good old-fashioned detective story, but for me, not quite one of my favorite Asimov books. And then we have The End of Eternity. The End of Eternity was a 9 out of 10 for me, and I think it is Isaac Asimov's best book. It is a time travel story, and it sets up some interesting things in the first half. But the first half, I had a few questions. There are a few things that were bugging me. There are a few sort of loose threads or plot holes that I had problems with. And then the second half is absolutely brilliant. The ending is so clever. I love how everything came together. And not only is the ending awesome, it retroactively makes the first half better. All the questions I had were answered. All of the things that bothered me were resolved. It was so impressive to me the way that Asimov created all of these puzzles, and just as I started to think that things might be falling apart, he managed to put all of the puzzle pieces together. I highly recommend this to everyone, especially people that are fans of time travel. And lastly, we have The Gods Themselves. So I gave The Gods Themselves a 6 out of 10, and unfortunately this is my least favorite Asimov book. I actually really liked part 1, it's a 3-part book. There's a great premise at the beginning of the story, and I was definitely intrigued and hooked in by the first part, and then Part 2, which some people love, it is very ambitious, it is unique, but I found it to be a little weird and confusing, and Asimov perhaps trying to show off just a little bit too much, and then I think he wraps things up relatively well in Part 3, but I was somewhat disconnected and less invested in the story by that point. So I think it's worth checking out because it does stand apart from his other novels, but it's one that just didn't quite click for me. So as we tally those up, that is a 7.4 out of 10 average for Isaac Asimov. Let's see if Arthur C. Clarke can top it. Let's start things off with Childhood's End. I'll be honest, we're starting with a banger. Childhood's End was a 10 out of 10 for me. This is a top 10 science fiction book of mine. I absolutely love it. Another book that is split into 3 parts. I love the first part. Second part was even better. Third part was somehow even better than that. The ending of this book just blew me away. It's one that I can't wait to reread because there's so many interesting ideas to do with aliens and people and our place within the universe. It just summarizes everything that I love about science fiction. Please, please, please read Childhood's End. Up next, The City and the Stars. The City and the Stars was an 8 out of 10 for me. I absolutely loved the first 50 pages. The world building here is incredible. The way that Arthur C. Clarke was able to imagine some of this technology, especially in 1956, for a city that exists billions of years in the future, was just absolutely mind-blowing to me. Unfortunately, I think this story progressed in a way that wasn't quite as satisfying as the opening was, and while I still liked it, perhaps not one of my favorite Arthur C. Clarke books. Moving on, A Fall of Moondust. A Fall of Moondust for me was an 8.5 out of 10. It is a rescue/survival story that I think will appeal to fans of The Martian. It doesn't have as much humor and the pacing isn't quite as fast, but if you like sort of diving into a rescue mission, using science, using ideas, I think this book is a lot of fun. It's a little bit more plot focused, a little bit more character focused than some other Clarke books, so if you're not someone that reads a lot of classic science fiction, not someone that is used to reading ideas-driven sci-fi, but you want to try some Arthur C. Clarke, this might actually be a good place to start. And then we have 2001: A Space Odyssey. So this was a 9 out of 10 for me. I'm a big fan of the book, and I'm a big fan of the film. Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke worked on these together, and as Clarke described it, the screenplay was written by Kubrick and Clarke, and the book was written by Clarke and Kubrick. Almost everything in this book was awe-inspiring to me. I loved the opening, I was so intrigued by the monolith. HAL 9000 I thought was fascinating. There were a couple of teeny tiny dry bits throughout the middle, but overall I loved this book, and the ending had me rushing to my laptop in order to try and explore some fan theories and explanations in order to figure out what on earth I just read, because the ending blew me away, kind of confused me, but also blew me away. And then we have Rendezvous with Rama. For me, Rendezvous with Rama was an 8 out of 10. It's one of his most famous and award-winning novels, and while I did still like it, it's not quite as high on my own personal Arthur C. Clarke list. I did really like the premise, and trying to picture some of the visuals in this book was really fun. It was kind of trippy, but there were a couple of slow moments, and the ending It's a thought-provoking one, and one that I've grown to appreciate over time. I didn't love it as much when I finished reading the book, but the fact that it stayed with me has kind of increased my opinion of the ending over time, but I still don't quite put it on the level of 2001 or Childhood's End. Moving on, we have The Fountains of Paradise. I gave The Fountains of Paradise an 8.5 out of 10. This book follows a couple of different storylines, one being a king thousands of years ago building some rather grandiose pleasure gardens, and then in the future we have a society that is trying to build a tower to space. And there's some interesting parallels there narratively and thematically, and Clarke throws in a couple of twists in there as well that I really enjoyed. Though the opening of this book was great, I loved the ending. Just a little bit of a lull in the middle that prevented this being an all-time favorite, but I really enjoyed The Fountains of Paradise. And finally we have The Songs of Distant Earth. For me, this was a 7 out of 10. I did like the setup where we had some people that are living on a planet that is mostly covered by water, and then we have another group of humans come on a colonization ship, arrive, and there's some interesting interactions there, some different cultures, we have some goals for the future of humanity, and I really liked what was going on initially, but this book dragged a little bit for me. It's around 300 pages, which is on the longer side for Arthur C. Clarke, and I don't think it had quite as much plot progression, not as many new ideas as some of his other books. So while I did like it, it's probably my least favorite Clarke book that I've read so far. So as we crunch the numbers, the average score for Arthur C. Clarke comes out to an 8.4 out of 10, giving him the victory over Isaac Asimov. Ultimately, I think both of these authors deserve all the credit in the world for their contributions to science fiction. But in the end, I think personally, I just gravitate slightly more towards Clarke's style. I think he's very consistent, and I think he had the highest high point with Childhood's End, which is one of my all-time favorite books. And just to wrap this up, interestingly, this is a debate that Clarke and Asimov actually had themselves. They were friendly rivals and were often asked who is the best science fiction writer in the world. And they actually came to an agreement on this, which they referred to as the Clarke-Asimov Treaty, in which Asimov would be referred to as the best science writer in the world, with Clarke being number 2, and Clarke would be referred to as the best science fiction writer in the world, with Asimov being number 2. And Clarke actually put this into writing with a dedication to Isaac Asimov in his book, Report on Planet 3 and Other Speculations, when he wrote, "In accordance with the terms of the Clarke-Asimov Treaty, the second best science writer dedicates this book to the second best science fiction writer." So there you go, I went with Arthur C. Clarke, and it appears that Clarke and Asimov may agree that the correct answer is Clarke as well, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button, and if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima, A New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, and Arthur C. Collin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.